So today's talk is called Interdependence in Science and Religion. And one of the purposes of the center is to show that the teachings of the mystics and the teachings of modern science are compatible with each other. And interdependence is one of the key ideas, particularly in Buddhism, but it's also present in other religions. And I thought I'd take a look today at how you can also find this idea of interdependence in science. So Nagarjuna was a Buddhist philosopher who founded the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, and he was the one that really formulated this specific notion of interdependence. And he said things derive their being and nature by mutual dependence and are nothing in themselves. So this is interesting because, first of all, they derive their being and nature by mutual dependence. So they have a being and nature. Things aren't just nothing. They have a being and a nature, but it's derived through mutual dependence upon other things. And in themselves, if you were to try and isolate them from everything else, they're nothing. You really have nothing if you try and isolate things by themselves. So insofar as things exist at all, they exist in mutual dependence upon other things. And we can see a similar idea in quantum theory. Heisenberg, who was one of the founders of quantum theory, said that elementary particles are certainly not eternal and indestructible units. They actually can be transformed into each other. So Democritus in ancient Greece had this idea that atoms, and actually the etymology of the word atom means you can't divide it. They were conceived of these individual, indestructible, eternal little particles that would go around and bounce into each other. And there was no destroying them, no changing them. They were what they were, and they existed forever, and they had an objective existence in and of themselves, independent of anything else. But modern physics really showed that this is not the case. Not only can atoms be divided into subatomic particles, but these subatomic particles themselves transform into each other, so they don't really have an eternal existence. They pop in and out of existence, they can be transformed into energy through annihilation with their antiparticles, and so on. And so they aren't these indestructible, eternal, objectively existing units of matter that was originally conceived of. So matter itself does not have this property of having an independent existence in and of itself. They exist through mutual relation with other things. Going back to religion, D.T. Suzuki, a Japanese Buddhist philosopher, said all things are products of various causes and conditions, and there's nothing that can be called an independent, solitary, self-originating primary nature. A different way of saying basically the same thing. Except he expands a little bit on here to talk about causes and conditions, that there are different ways that things can be in interdependence on other things. We'll get into that in more detail as the talk goes on. But one of the ways in which things depend on each other is through causes. Some things can be caused by other things, and that's a way in which they depend on things. And there are also conditions, other kinds of conditions that things require in order to exist. We'll get into that more as well. Niels Bohr echoes this same idea. He was another one of the founders of modern physics. He said material particles are abstractions, their properties being definable and observable only through their interaction with other systems. So these other systems are kind of the conditions through which these properties come into being. This quote could really be a talk in and of itself, going into exactly how these properties exist only dependent on observation and so on. It's a very interesting philosophical question in quantum theory, though, how properties of things depend on observation. And the takeaway idea here, though, is that these properties don't exist in and of themselves. They only exist through interaction with other systems. Particularly, he's referring here to the measurement systems, the systems we use to go out and discover what these properties are. There's a sense in which those properties don't have an independent existence until we define a measuring system and go out and determine those properties through a measurement process. Going back to the mystics, Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, said, being and non-being create each other. So you don't have just being existing by itself or non-being existing by itself. These are in interdependence on each other. Similarly, difficult and easy support each other, long and short define each other, high and low depend on each other. All of these dualities that we experience in life depend on their opposites. You can't talk about one without at least implicitly understanding there must be another. So the one doesn't exist independently of its opposite. And before and after follow each other. Didn't quite get to the quote there, did I? So after this slide, we have this general idea of distinction, which is that whenever we draw a distinction, we're separating one thing from its opposite. So in this case, we have a distinction between the inside of a circle and the outside of the circle. You draw the distinction and you immediately are creating both sides of that distinction. You can't draw the circle and only create the inside. You create the outside at the same time. And similarly, when we define ourselves, we define that by a distinction. And that very distinction also defines the outside of ourselves. And so these two arise together through the process of distinguishing them from each other. And it's not that they exist before that distinction. This distinction is what actually creates them through mutual dependence. So let's focus on a few types of dependence and see how they show up in science. The first is a dependence on a prior temporal cause. So things depend on what came before them. They wouldn't have existed if something that came earlier in time hadn't existed. So for example, a tree wouldn't exist without its seed. We wouldn't exist without our parents, and so on. Another is dependence on the context or environment in which something exists. Things depend for their existence in many ways upon a constant interaction or dependence on things in their environment. We'll get into this in more detail. This is just the outline. Dependence on material causes and parts. If you take away what something's made of, take away all of its parts, it's not going to be there anymore, so it depends on those. And dependence on formal causes or conceptual designation. This is a little more subtle, but basically the idea is that things depend on superimposing upon a form the idea that something exists there. So we'll get into that later. So let's focus first on prior causes and time. So each of us depends for our existence on the fact that our mother gave birth to us. For the first 9 months of our existence, we were completely dependent on our mothers. Our mothers breathed for us, they ate for us. If our mothers died, we would die. So we gained all of our sustenance from our mother. So there was a complete dependence upon our mothers there, which is pretty clear. A little more subtle than that is the fact that we also depended on our fathers. We couldn't have been conceived without our fathers as well. So we also have a dependence on our fathers. So there's a dependence of our existence upon both of our parents at a prior time. Of course, our parents may no longer be with us, but back in time, without our parents, we wouldn't be here. So there's a complete dependence of our lives on our parents. Now, similarly, each of our parents, of course, was born from their mothers and also their fathers. So they had a complete dependence upon their parents. So indirectly, we have a complete dependence on all four of our grandparents. Without our grandparents, we wouldn't be here. So we exist in dependence on all four of our grandparents. And you can probably see where this is going. Each of our four grandparents depending completely on their parents, and so our existence is completely dependent on all 8 of our great-grandparents, and on all 16 of our great-great-grandparents, and on all 32 of our great-great-great-grandparents. So without all 32 of those people, we wouldn't be here. And you can extrapolate this back in time even farther. And scientists have estimated that there's a common ancestor to all of us approximately 10,000 years ago. So not only do we all exist in dependence upon all of these ancestors, but we can all be traced back to at least one common ancestor. So that's a sense in which we are all interrelated with each other and cousins with each other. And so this interdependence is also something that interconnects us all with each other. And that's another important consequence of this idea, is that everything is interconnected through this interdependence. Now, of course, you can go back farther than just our human ancestors and go back millions of years. Homo sapiens get traced back through other species in the genus Homo. And so we're cousins with the Neanderthals and Homo erectus and all of these other species that have gone extinct. And we're also cousins with all of the animals. You trace all of their ancestry back in time, and ultimately we merge with plants and fungi and everything. All of life gets traced back to a common ancestor. If you look at our DNA code, it's all the same language that we share. All of the genetic components in the double helix, the code there is the same for all of life, really, which points to this universal ancestor that really gave rise to all of life on Earth. And so we are cousins with the trees and the bacteria and the insects and everything living on this planet. And the planet itself, of course, is the mother of all of life. So if the Earth hadn't been here, life couldn't have arisen. It couldn't have arisen and evolved just in a vacuum and empty space. So the Earth is our mother as well, and continues to be. So where did the Earth come from? Well, it arose from a supernova, the remnants of a star that once exploded. And just to briefly describe how this happens, when a star gets created, normally it starts out with mostly just hydrogen gas, and as the star goes through its life, it converts this hydrogen into heavier elements like helium, and eventually it gets to the point where if the star has sufficient mass, it will go through an explosive process called a nova or a supernova, in which it literally explodes itself, and in that tremendous explosion it creates all sorts of heavier elements, and then these heavier elements get scattered about and eventually coalesce back to form hard planets with these heavier elements like the Earth. And so the Earth was created from this exploding star that once existed. So had it not been for that exploding star, the Earth wouldn't have even existed. Life couldn't have arisen. All of our ancestors wouldn't have arisen. So we exist in dependence on that supernova that took place. And where did that come from? Well, as I said, it came from another star. And that star came from a bunch of hydrogen gas that was created in the earliest phase of the universe. So you can trace the whole universal history back to the creation of those hydrogen atoms that gave rise to that star. And that all happened in this very early phase of the universe, right after what's called the Big Bang. And we don't really know what the nature of the Big Bang is. People are still trying to figure it out. This is all extrapolation back in time, of course, based on the current theories of physics. So it's well accepted in the current theories of physics, but I should emphasize that this is an extrapolation based on that theoretical context that's currently accepted and is subject to revision, as all of science is subject to revision. But in any case, it gets traced back to this point where the current theories of physics no longer work. So at sufficiently high energies and densities, the laws no longer apply, and you enter the realm of physics that has yet to be discovered. And so we don't really know, in terms of scientific knowledge, what happened before that. So really, we are all dependent on an ultimate prior cause in time that's a mystery. So, now on to another type of dependence, dependence on our context or environment. Right now, our continued existence depends on the fact that we're breathing air. And if you're a normal person, you have about 3 minutes before you pass out and start to die if you're denied air. So we depend on the fact that we're able to breathe air and exchange air with our environment. We breathe in this air, our lungs take oxygen from the air, and the oxygen gives us energy to metabolize and live, and we expel carbon dioxide. Another thing we depend on is water to drink. We can last a little bit longer without water, something on the order of 3 days, and we start to really become in danger of dying. And we also depend on food to eat. We can last somewhere around 3 weeks before we start to really become in danger of dying from water. These are rough estimates. But basically, this points to the fact that we can't just exist in isolation. Our continued existence right now, irrespective of causes back in time from our parents and so forth, depends on this exchange with our environment of air, water, and food. If we were denied those things, we would perish. So our existence is in dependence on all of those. Now you can trace this out a little further. Well, where do those come from? Where does the air, in particular the oxygen in the air and the water and the food, come from? Well, the oxygen in the air is created through the process of photosynthesis in the plants and algae. And that is driven by sunlight. And so the sun hits the leaves in the plants convert the energy from the sunlight into building carbohydrates that they use, and they take in carbon dioxide and convert that into oxygen that we then breathe. So if it weren't for the sun and the plants, we wouldn't have oxygen to breathe. So we don't just exist in dependence on the air, but also in dependence on the plants that convert the carbon dioxide to the oxygen that we need to breathe, and the sunshine that drives that process energetically. And the rain, of course, comes down from the clouds, which exist in dependence on the ocean. The moisture from the clouds is created because the sunlight warms the oceans and evaporates the water, converts it into water vapor, and then it later condenses and falls down, and we're able to drink the fresh water. And so this whole cycle, also with the water, is created in dependence on the atmosphere, the ocean, and the sunlight. So without those things, we wouldn't have the water to drink. And our food depends on a whole web of life feeding on life, really. There's a whole food chain, or really food web is a more accurate description, that is also ultimately driven from sunlight. Either the plankton or algae take the sunlight, and plants and then the animals eat the plants. We either eat the plants directly ourselves, or other animals eat the plants, and then animals eat those animals, and then we end up eating one of the animals. And so the whole web of life that feeds on each other is something that we're dependent on as well. So our food comes from other plants and animals that are interdependent on each other through this whole web, and ultimately also dependent on the sun. Now you might say, well, that's fine for life, but what about something like a rock? How does it depend on its environment? You can even throw it out into space and it'll still be a rock, right? So it seems like it's pretty independent of other things like its environment. But in fact, if a rock depends for its existence on things like the temperature and pressure around it. If you take a rock and you heat it up, it will melt, like molten lava coming out of a volcano. If you put it under sufficient pressure, it'll just crumble and fall apart. If you heat it up even farther, it will actually, all the elements will disintegrate. It'll turn into plasma. So this is a little what's called a state diagram, which shows that as you increase the pressure and temperature, the state of matter will change between gas, solid, and liquid. And so the rock's existence as a solid depends on its environment, in the sense that if you change the pressure and temperature of its environment, it will change as well. It will no longer, you wouldn't call it a rock if it evaporated into a gas or a plasma. And so the rock's continued existence depends on its environmental conditions of temperature and pressure. And those, at least on Earth, are dependent on the fact that the Earth has a relatively stable temperature and pressure and so on. As I mentioned before, if you put the rock down in a volcano, it melts. So the conditions on Earth aren't totally conducive to the continued existence of rocks. But and as well as, I should mention also, water flowing over the rock will eventually erode it, take the elements off, and chemicals can interact with it, break it apart. And so the environment, it's not impervious to the environment. And even the very atoms in things, also there's an analogous state diagram that even the very nucleus of all the atoms is made of protons and neutrons. And you can think by analogy as those as being a kind of a rock. And just as you can heat up the rock and melt it, if you put an atomic nucleus within an environment where the pressure and energy density is sufficiently high, it actually breaks apart. And this is actually part of the process that happens in the center of the sun when it converts elements into each other. The process of nuclear fusion takes the hydrogen atoms and creates helium, and helium creates heavier elements. So even the nuclei in atoms aren't entirely stable and depend on their environment. So let's look at another way in which things depend on other things, and that's material parts. So let's consider a drop of water. This single drop of water wouldn't exist without all the water molecules in the drop of water. If you took away all of the water molecules, you wouldn't have a drop of water left. So the drop of water depends on all of those water molecules for its existence. And each of those water molecules is made of an atom of oxygen and 2 atoms of hydrogen. If you took away any of those parts of the water molecule, you would no longer have water. You wouldn't have a water molecule if you took away any of those parts. So that water molecule also depends for its existence on its parts. And each of those atoms depends on its existence upon its parts. So in its nucleus are protons and neutrons with electrons orbiting, and if you take away those, you no longer have those atoms. Their actual identity changes. If you add a proton to a nucleus of oxygen, it's no longer oxygen. If you take one away, it's no longer oxygen. If you shuffle these particles around, their actual identity changes. So they exist their existence depends upon those parts, and in particular what parts are present and which aren't. And then continuing this, each of those subatomic particles, as Heisenberg said, quote at the beginning of the talk, they actually transform into each other and transform into energy. So each of those protons and neutrons can actually be transformed into each other under appropriate conditions. And this is actually how the big particle accelerators work, is they take these particles and smash them into each other and create sufficiently high energies that these transformations actually take place, which normally don't take place. And then they can study how the interactions between them actually work. What are the patterns of transformation between these particles? And we can then try to understand the laws that govern those transformations. So consider another example of a chair. Just as a water droplet depends on its parts for its existence, a chair, something as simple as a chair, also depends on its parts for its existence. So we could disassemble one of these chairs and we'd have a bunch of pieces of wood. And if you did that, you wouldn't call it a chair. You'd call it a bunch of pieces of wood, or at best, the pieces of a chair. But you wouldn't say, there's a chair, until you assembled it. And so the chair depends on its existence upon those parts. And each of those pieces of wood depends on the pieces of cellulose and other kinds of components. So if you shredded them up and got a bunch of sawdust, you wouldn't call those pieces of a chair, you'd call it a pile of dust. Right? So you would no longer even have the pieces of a chair anymore. You'd say, well, I have a bunch of sawdust. But those pieces of the chair depend on those particles for their existence. If you took away all of the cellulose and other elements from those pieces of the chair, you wouldn't have pieces of the chair anymore. And of course, the sawdust is made of these carbon molecules and other kinds of molecules. And if you took those molecules out of the sawdust, let's say you took all the atoms out of the sawdust, you wouldn't have sawdust anymore, would you? So they depend on the atoms and so on. Everything material ultimately comes back to these subatomic particles that depend on each other and energy and so on. Now, this actually is a nice segue to this final way in which things depend upon other things, and that's conceptual designation, or the formal cause of things. So, as I was saying before, the parts of the chair, when you assemble them, you wouldn't actually call them a chair until they're assembled. Right? So you wouldn't say the chair exists if all you had were a bunch of pieces laying around. But when you assemble those pieces together, then you say, there's a chair. So where did that chair come from? Well, all the pieces were there before the chair was there, right? So it wasn't like some new substance was created. You just rearranged those pieces, and then once they got into a form that we conventionally call chair, then we say, a chair is there. So where did that existence of the chair come from? It didn't come from the parts, because the parts were there before, and the parts are there in the chair. The only thing that changed here is how those parts are arranged in space, the form that they take. And so they get arranged in a certain form, and then we say, it's a chair. The chair exists. But its existence comes from the fact that we conceptually designate that form of pieces to be a chair. And that's our convention that we have. When things are arranged in a certain way, we then can call it a chair. And so that chair exists as a chair. We're not saying the parts exist dependent on conceptual designation yet, but the chair exists when parts come into a certain form that we conventionally regard as a chair, and we conceptually designate, oh, there's a chair. So we project upon that form the word chair and say it exists. Well, of course, this similarly applies to the parts. We wouldn't say that's a piece of wood unless certain properties were present. It had cellulose and so forth. You know, we could actually do a chemical analysis of something and say whether it's wood or not. And if the analysis of that piece of that part of a chair resulted in the fact that certain properties were present, then we would say, well, that's a piece of wood. If those properties weren't present, we wouldn't designate that a piece of wood. It would be something, but it wouldn't be a piece of wood. And so, in that sense, the wood exists because we have a convention that if certain properties are present, we call it a piece of wood. And if they're not present, we don't call it a piece of wood. So, the wood exists through conceptual designation. And similarly for the sawdust, if it's a pile of metal, we wouldn't call it sawdust. It has different properties. If a bunch of particles piled up have properties of sawdust, we call it sawdust. If it doesn't, we don't. And the same is true for the atoms. If it has a certain number of protons in it, we call it carbon or oxygen or whatever. If it doesn't, we don't. So those atoms, it exists as an oxygen atom if it has the properties that we say oxygen is supposed to have. So it exists as an oxygen atom insofar as we designate it as satisfying those properties, those conventional properties that we decide oxygen has or doesn't have. And so the same goes for the subatomic particles. When we analyze them, they have certain properties. Some go at the speed of light, like photons. Others don't, like electrons. They don't go at the speed of light. And they have mass and charge and things like this that we use to distinguish the subatomic particles from each other. If a particle doesn't have any charge, we wouldn't call it an electron. So a particle exists as a certain type of particle insofar as we designate it as satisfying the properties of that particle. So, to summarize, the chair exists in dependence on our conceptual designation of that as a chair, in accordance with the conventional definition of a chair. Now, some people, there's some weird modern art kind of chairs, and you can look at it and say, well, that's not a chair, and someone else may say, well, sure, it's a chair. That's a chair. I'm French, it's a chair. So whether it exists as a chair depends on the conventional definition of a chair that you adopt. Now, we can't just create a chair by thinking chair, absent of any kind of conditions, right? So if I'm out in the woods and or better yet, I'm at the top of a mountain and all there is granite rock, and I would really like a lazy boy chair. I can't just think lazy boy chair and voila, a lazy boy chair manifests, right? Because the conventional conditions or definition of a chair don't exist in that environment. So we only properly designate something as existing conceptually if it satisfies those conditions of the conventional definition. So if there is something in front of me and it doesn't satisfy the conventional definition of a chair, I can think that's a chair, but it's not going to behave like the conventional definition of a chair. So if I think that it's going to behave like a chair and it doesn't satisfy the conditions that a chair satisfies, I'm going to be surprised or disappointed, or my bottom's going to hurt or something. So in a sense, it's like an internal contradiction. If I start thinking something satisfies the conventional definition of a chair when it actually doesn't. So that's kind of what happens if we think we can just dream up whatever we like whenever we want. These conventional definitions have, they're conventions for a reason. They're adopted conventionally and not by us alone, just our imagination. So the same is true for sawdust or carbon atoms or really anything. These definitions aren't arbitrary. One scientist can't just decide, oh, well, I'm going to start calling a carbon atom an oxygen atom. Well, you could do that, but all the other scientists will think he's nuts. So here's an illustration of kind of what happens when those pieces come together and then we imagine that now the chair exists. So here's a collection of stars, and it doesn't look like it has any particular pattern right now. But if we rearrange these, suddenly we see, oh, something kind of jumps out at us. These stars are the Big Dipper. And what the mind kind of does when it sees this pattern, just like when it sees something that looks like a chair, is it immediately kind of connects the dots and superimposes on that pattern that idea. Oh, there's the Big Dipper. Or, oh, there's the chair. And boom, it's more than just the sum of the parts, it's something extra. It's a chair, it's the Big Dipper, it's whatever. But that extra is something that our imagination is doing. It's not something that already exists in the sky, right? There's not a real dipper up there. The stars don't have like a real agreement between them that they're connected to each other, right? It doesn't exist objectively. It's something imaginary. Similarly, for these lines, they don't have a particular meaning unless we arrange them in a certain way. And then, boom, our minds automatically, unconsciously really, we learn to do this, and it's a good thing we do, but it instantly sees that as more than just 3 lines. That's the letter A. Now, so that this letter A depends for its existence on this conventional definition of what an A is. So I can't just say that's an O, at least not and be understood by anyone else who adopts the same conventions. Now, it may be that another culture has a different alphabet and different meanings and so on, and they might call that an O, but according to our conventions of letters and our alphabet, I can't just call that an O and be consistent with the conventional definitions of letters. So I'm not free to just arbitrarily, conceptually designate anything I like and to be consistent with the conventions. So we don't say that something conventionally exists in a valid way unless the imagination posits that existence in accordance with those conventional definitions. And we can't just arbitrarily change those. We can't just, even though the border between the US and Canada is a convention that a bunch of people have agreed on, you can't just individually decide that it's in a different place and expect that to work very well with other people. So, more perhaps related to what the mystics are talking about is the fact that our definition of ourselves also exists conventionally. So we have a conventional definition of ourself that depends on certain distinctions between body and mind and spirit. So this piece of matter is part of me, and this piece of matter is not. And that's part of our kind of convention of what we adopt in conventional reality. And as long as we all are kind of in general agreement about where those distinctions ought to be drawn, we get along and more or less agree upon things. And then we make even more subtle distinctions about, well, this is not me, but it belongs to me. It's my property, or it's your property. And then we can transfer the property, and we can imagine all sorts of extra things on top of this. But the basic distinction here that's relevant to spirituality and mysticism is the basic distinction between myself and the world. What is me? What is the world? And so in addition to my body and the rest of the world, there's my mind and everyone else's mind, and my thoughts and everyone else's thought. And there are distinctions drawn there in our minds that are conventional. And we can't just draw those arbitrarily without psychiatrists starting to take an interest in us. So we exist, that conventional existence is in dependence upon these conventional definitions of what a person is, where these lines between bodies in the world and our minds and other people's minds and so on are conventionally drawn. Now that's not to say that they have an absolute reality, just as the definition of what is and isn't a chair can shift from culture to culture. Different cultures can also draw these distinctions between self and other in different ways. And you can also, in different states of consciousness, kind of experience the world either with these distinctions shifted, out-of-body experiences, all sorts of phenomena like this, or even suspending all those distinctions altogether, and the world can be experienced in a completely different way that doesn't conform to these worldly conventions of self and other. Which isn't to say they're invalid experiences, they're just experiences that you wouldn't say conform to those conventional definitions. So if you experience the world in some radically different way like that, and then try to communicate it, and people are understanding you in terms of these conventional definitions, there can be a problem understanding each other. And this is why it's sometimes said that mystics understand mystics, but often other people don't. It's sort of a mystery. And that's often because most people are more or less stuck in experiencing the world in accordance with these conventional definitions and ways of drawing distinctions, and can't even imagine experiencing the world in a different way because it seems as though that's the way the world actually is. There's not an understanding that these are conventions that have a relative existence but not an absolute existence. So there's this idea of a base of reference. And this is what you might say the context of these conventions. So one culture might have one base of reference, in other words, one set of definitions for its conventions, but you can shift that to, say, another culture and a different base of reference, and you have different definitions, different conventions. And so things that conventionally exist relative to one base of reference might not exist relative to another. So let's try and understand this through a concrete example of motion and rest. It seems pretty clear to us that something either is or is not in motion or rest. This gong here is at rest, and if I toss it across the room, it's in motion until it comes to rest again. But actually, that definition of motion and rest isn't absolute. It depends on a set of definitions that I can call a base of reference. And to illustrate this, consider the heliocentric model of our solar system. According to this model, the sun is at rest. It doesn't move. And the planets are revolving around the sun. And the moon revolves around the earth, which revolves around the sun. So in this model, it is valid to say that the sun is motionless, it's at rest, and the planets are in motion. That's a valid statement from that base of reference. But you can shift the base of reference, and you can consider the geocentric model, which was the cosmology before Copernicus, where the Earth is at rest. Certainly doesn't feel like we're moving, right? So it was intuitively obvious to them that the Earth wasn't moving. And if you look up in the sky, we even say this today, the sun rises and the sun sets. The sun is in motion, right, through the sky. It comes up, goes down. So we even talk today in terms of the sun moving. So according to this model, which in a certain sense is more intuitive, the sun is moving around the Earth. It rises, it sets, it comes up, it goes down, as well as all the planets. They're in motion. And according to this base of reference, motion of the sun is a valid conventional statement. I can say that motion actually exists. And I'm correct in that base of reference. And if I say the Earth is at rest, that's correct. Whereas if I shift to the heliocentric model, those statements are now incorrect. And I have to, in fact, reverse them completely. So something that's true in one frame of reference or base of reference is not true in another. And so these are not absolute definitions, these conventional designations, but they depend on this base of reference. So it's important to note here that if we decide to shift our base of reference from the geocentric model to the heliocentric model and back, we're not doing anything physical here. I'm not taking the sun and stopping it and then throwing the Earth into motion. There's no physical change happening here. It's a reorientation in the imagination of what actually the definition of motion is. Motion is only defined in reference to something that isn't in motion. And so to define motion depends on what our definition of being at rest is. So rest and motion arise in dependence on each other. Just like Lao Tzu was saying, all these opposites arise in dependence on each other. So there's no absolute motion or absolute rest. These things arise in dependence on each other and don't have an absolute independent existence. Another example is gravity. In Newton's vision of the nature of gravity, it's a force that acts between two masses that pulls them together. And that's a valid conception of the nature of gravity in the Newtonian paradigm. But in the Einsteinian paradigm, that's not true. Actually, gravity is not a force, according to Einstein. It's the curvature of space. And objects follow curved paths through space, not because there's a force pulling on them, but because the space itself is curved. And they're just following what they consider to be a straight line with no force acting on them. So saying gravity is a force is true in one base of reference, but not in another base of reference. So the nature of gravity shifts depending on the base of reference. It conventionally exists according to one base of reference, but not another. And again, it's important to note that when we shift the base of reference, we're not doing something magical to gravity. We're not somehow influencing the nature of gravity. We're actually changing how we're defining things in the world. So whether gravity even exists or not depends on this more fundamental framework of thought. And it also is true in mathematics that truths exist relative to a base of reference, or the axioms that we use to define what's true and not. So let's look at a couple examples. 7 plus 7 equals 2. most of us would say that's false. And the reason we'd say it's false is because we're implicitly assuming conventional arithmetic, where numbers added to other numbers always end up with a larger number. It never happens that you add A and B together and get a number C that's smaller than either A or B. You always get something larger than both of them, unless one of them is negative. But in this case, we have two positive numbers together, and we're getting another number that's smaller than both of them. Well, that's obviously false, unless you're adding hours. If you add 7 hours to 7 o'clock, you get 2 o'clock, right?
Ooh.
So shifting your axioms of your mathematics, and that's technically in mathematics called arithmetic modulo 12, and it's like a valid kind of arithmetic that you can do, and you define it in mathematics, and it's not the same as mathematics as we normally think about the arithmetic. So that's a shift in the base of reference that makes something that was otherwise false into something that is then true. So the truth and falsity of even mathematics, something as simple as arithmetic, addition of two numbers, depends on this base of reference. And if you remember your high school geometry, the sum of the angles, of the interior angles of any triangle, always add up to 180 degrees, right? Well, this statement, the sum of the angles is not 180 degrees, would be false. Unless you're in non-Euclidean geometry, like on the surface of the Earth, if you draw a triangle with 3 straight lines, you add up their angles, you can actually get, in fact, you always get something more than 180 degrees. You can imagine a straight line from the North Pole to the equator, and then around the equator, say a quarter of the way, and then back up to the North Pole. Those are 3 straight lines. They form a triangle, and each angle is 90 degrees. 90 plus 90 plus 90 is 270. It's not 180. It's only on a flat plane that that's true. So that's an example of shifting the base of reference in geometry that can change what was otherwise a true mathematical statement into a false one, and vice versa. So all these things that we consider true and false are implicitly true or false based on something more fundamental that we may not even be aware of. Here's another one. Doubling the elements in a set does not increase its size. So a set is just a collection of things, like marbles in a bag. You put a bunch of marbles in a bag, and let's say there are 10. You double the number of marbles in the bag, you get 20. It increases the number of marbles, right? So this is obviously, you've lost your marbles if you think this. Doubling the elements of a set, the number of marbles in a bag, does not increase its size. How could that possibly be true? Well, all you have to do is shift the base of reference from finite sets to infinite sets. The set of all even numbers is infinite. If you add to that the set of all odd numbers, which is the same size, you can just add 1 to each of the even numbers and you get an odd number, right? So it's the same size as the set of even numbers. So you add all the even numbers to add all odd numbers. So you have a bag of even numbers and a bag of odd numbers. You throw them together into one bag, and you have the bag of all numbers. It's the same size. If you don't believe it's the same size, you can actually match them up 1 to 1 by simply matching them in this way. You take the number 1, and you match it with twice the number 1, the number 2. Take number 2, you match it with 4. Take number 3, you match it with 6. Take number. You can keep doing this, and all the even numbers are matched 1 to 1 with all the numbers. So the size of the even numbers is actually the same as the size of all the numbers. It's very counterintuitive, but mathematically that's how it works out according to that base of reference. So a perplexing statement like this that's manifestly false, according to our usual way of understanding things, can actually be true if we shift our fundamental assumptions, our base of reference. So these are kind of examples to get across the sense that so much of the way we understand and take for granted about things depends on these implicit assumptions we're making about how things always are. But in fact, they're not always that way. They're not necessarily that way. They're only that way according to a conventional set of definitions that we've adopted. And if we shift those definitions, things can change completely. This is why sometimes things that mystics say can seem so counterintuitive and paradoxical and contradictory and so on, because they're not necessarily speaking from the same base of reference that we are. So shifting the base of reference doesn't cause a true statement to become false. It actually shifts the definitions underlying that actually define what's true and false. So it's not like we're taking something true and saying, well, that's not true anymore. It's just, well, that's not true relative to this base of reference, or that's not true relative to that base of reference. So the truth and falsity, it's not like we're denying one and asserting the other. We're just recognizing that this depends on fundamental assumptions that are adopted or not adopted. So by analogy, it's not that the sun is really at rest or in motion, or that the earth really is at rest and in motion. It's that our very definition of rest and motion depends on our base of reference that we've selected. And similarly, for our own identity, our own self, these conventional definitions we've adopted conventionally, normally, also can be shifted. And the experience we have of the world that seems so obviously the case is itself based on some of these unquestioned fundamental assumptions that are made, unconsciously usually, of a deep base of reference that can be shifted and totally alter our way of experiencing the world in such a way that can make our normal experience seem very, very different. Also, this shift in the base of reference shows us that that one way of experiencing the world isn't an absolute way of experiencing the world. Just as the earth isn't truly at rest or in motion, but is one or the other depending on our base of reference. Similarly, our definition of ourself, where that self-world other boundary is drawn, depends on our base of reference. So here's a quote from Franklin Merrill Wolff that pertains directly to this. I'd like to read it because I think it's quite relevant to this topic. And he's actually the one who has used the term base of reference in this context. This is a passage where he uses it. So he says, "The pure I is the 0 point of organized consciousness. It's the center of all systems of reference of our human kind of consciousness. I am at the point where I center my thought. If I habitually center myself in the body, then I am there in an exceedingly narrow kind of bondage. Such an identification with body is the essence of materialism. But I actually break this bondage every time I think myself away from body as to some other base of reference. And we're actually doing this sort of thing all the time, but commonly without realizing the significance of what we're doing. Simply to realize what one is doing in all this is to take a long step in the liberating process. I literally am where I think or otherwise function. So this definition of not just where I am, but really what I am, depends on this base of reference, these fundamental ways we have of really structuring our experience and defining what these things are, where these fundamental distinctions are drawn between self and world. So this ties into what Nagarjuna called emptiness. He said, since there's nothing whatever that is not dependently existent, for that reason there's nothing whatsoever that is not empty. And by empty here, he means specifically lacking independent self-existence. So things still have a conventional relative existence, interdependence, that kind of existence, but they don't have an independently existent reality. And that's because everything arises in dependence upon other things, as we've seen throughout this talk. And this is compatible with a lot of statements you'll find in other religions as well. So here's Shankara, a Hindu, and he says, no matter what a deluded man may think he's perceiving, he's really seeing Brahman and nothing else but Brahman. Brahman's their term for ultimate reality, non-dual reality. This universe of things like chairs, which is superimposed upon Brahman, just like we imagine those stars to be connected in the Big Dipper, we're superimposing something, is nothing but a name. It's this imaginative act of superimposing something, connecting those dots, and then imagining it has some real existence in and of itself, rather than arising because of this distinction, because of interdependence. The Sufi mystic philosopher Ibn Arabi says there's nothing in existence except God. God is, of course, their term for the ultimate non-dual reality. And if there's nothing in existence except God, well then everything that we see to be having some kind of independent existence of its own has no independent existence of its own, just as Nagarjuna was saying. Independent of anything else, it's empty. It has no existence. It only has an existence relative to other things. And the Christian philosopher, John Scotus Erigena, says, none of the things that are truly exists by itself, so independent of other things. The essence of all things is nothing. So again, he's echoing the same idea. So you find this thread throughout all the mystics. The Buddhists probably elaborate upon the idea of interdependence the most, but it does connect with statements that all the mystics have said in all the different traditions. And here we are back to Buddhism. Kalu Rinpoche says, we live in the illusion and the appearance of things. And by that he means that we take this conventional existence that is defined only relative to a base of reference, and we take it to be real. We mistake that to be somehow final and have some reality in and of itself, as opposed to being something dependent on a base of reference and these imaginative acts of making distinctions. So we live in that illusion of the appearance of things. But then he says there's a reality. We are that reality. When you understand this, by which he means when you realize this in a non-conceptual way, you see that you are nothing, and being nothing, you are everything. That is all. So this is one of those paradoxical things, when you start shifting the base of reference around, things don't make any sense. So just to summarize the talk, in case you fell asleep at any point, I'll briefly go over what I said, in case you missed it. So we're empty of independent existence because of dependence in time upon grandparents and so on, going back through time. We're empty of independent existence because of dependence on the environment, air, water, food, and so on. the sunshine. We and all material objects are empty because of dependence on our parts. You take away any of the parts that we have, we no longer exist. And everything is empty because of dependence on conceptual designation, really, because we've defined it as existing because it has these properties that exist conventionally according to definitions that we've adopted relative to a base of reference. So they exist by conceptual designation in accordance with a convention, not just arbitrarily. And if you shift the base of reference, conventions will change that define what conventionally exists and what doesn't exist, or is true or is false, relative to that base. And finally, the root of suffering is the fact that we habitually and unconsciously experience ourselves from a limited base of reference, or from one fixed base of reference, really, which makes it appear as though what exists only conventionally has some kind of absolute existence.
Wow.